Stop what you are doing. I want you to imagine something for me. You are in bed. It is 2 in the morning. The house is quiet. Your neighborhood is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked during the day, where kids ride their bikes in the street, where the biggest weekly drama is whose sprinklers are running too long. You live in California. You worked hard to get here. You have a good life, a safe life, a life that feels, in this moment, completely ordinary. And then you hear something. It is barely a sound, more like the feeling of a sound, a shift in the air, a creak that does not belong. And before you can even decide whether you imagined it, before you can even reach for your partner, before you can even sit up, a light hits you in the face, a flashlight, inches from your eyes, and a voice, low, controlled, calm in a way that is far more terrifying than anger would be. Do not move. Do not scream. If you scream, I will kill you. Now, here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. The man holding that flashlight is not a stranger in the way you picture a stranger. He is not desperate. He is not disorganized. He is not acting on impulse. He has been watching you for weeks. He knows your name. He knows what time you leave for work. He knows which nights your partner is home and which nights they are not. He knows the layout of your house better than some of your own family members do. He has jogged past your home a dozen times in broad daylight, and you smiled and waved. He has been inside your neighborhood for so long that your neighbors think he lives there. For 10 years across the entire state of California, this man did this to more than 50 families. And then for 30 years after that, he went home. He mowed his lawn. He watched television. He drove to the grocery store. He attended church. He bounced his grandchildren on his knee, and nobody knew. This is the story of the Golden State Killer, one of the most prolific unidentified serial predators in American history. The man who terrorized a state, erased himself from the face of the earth, and nearly got away with it forever. Nearly. Go back with me to California in the mid 1970s. Not the 1976 of textbooks, the real 1976, the one that smelled like cut grass and chlorine and charcoal on a summer Saturday. The 1976 of young families who had come from Kansas and Ohio and Virginia and Georgia, who had scraped together everything they had and bought a house in Sacramento, California, because Sacramento was exactly what the American dream was supposed to look like. Wide streets, quiet evenings, elementary schools 2 blocks away, neighbors who left their back doors open because nobody locked their back doors, kids who stayed out until the streetlights came on and came home muddy and happy and completely safe. The Vietnam War was finally over. The country was exhaling. In the flat, sun-hammered suburbs on the eastern edge of Sacramento, in places like Rancho Cordova and Carmichael and Citrus Heights, people were not thinking about danger. They were thinking about mortgage payments and youth soccer and whether the tomatoes in the back garden needed more water. They were not thinking about the man jogging past their house. Before the Sacramento attacks, there had been another shadow in California. The Visalia ransacker, a prowler and burglar who terrorized neighborhoods in Tulare County in the mid 1970s. In 2020, DeAngelo admitted murdering Claude Snelling in September 1975. That earlier chapter matters because it shows the pattern beginning before the name East Area Rapist ever entered the newspapers. He looked like everyone else, athletic, white. Somewhere in his late 20s, he ran with easy practice strides through the neighborhood streets in the early morning, nodding at the people he passed, unremarkable in every visible way. He had been running these streets for weeks. He had done it in Rancho Cordova, in Carmichael, in Citrus Heights. He had done it in dozens of neighborhoods across the eastern Sacramento suburbs, block by block, morning by morning, studying. He was not jogging for his health. He was selecting his next victim. In June of 1976, the offender, later known as the East Area Rapist, made one of his first confirmed Sacramento area attacks, a young woman. Her own home, the middle of the night. He was gone before morning. He left no fingerprints. He left no usable evidence. He left behind a woman whose life would never fully return to what it had been. The police investigated, found almost nothing. Hoped it was an isolated incident. It was not. By the end of 1976, he had struck 6 times. By the summer of 1977, the number was in the dozens. By 1978, the people of eastern Sacramento were living in a state of fear so pervasive, so grinding, so total that it had reshaped the texture of daily life. Gun sales in the Sacramento suburbs surged in a way the region had never seen. Hardware stores ran out of deadbolts. Women's self-defense classes filled within hours of being announced. Men slept with loaded firearms on their nightstands. Neighbors formed watch groups that met at kitchen tables and in church parking lots, maps spread out, patrol schedules written on legal pads, everyone exhausted, everyone afraid. People stopped doing things they had done without thinking for their entire lives. Sleeping with the windows open on warm nights, leaving the back door unlocked, letting their kids ride their bikes after dark, walking to a friend's house alone. Things that had seemed as ordinary as breathing suddenly felt like calculated risks, and he kept going. Here is what investigators began to piece together as the attacks mounted, and what made the East Area Rapist so uniquely terrifying among the dozens of violent offenders law enforcement dealt with every year. This man was not acting on impulse. He was not reckless. He was not disorganized. Every single attack was the product of meticulous, almost obsessive preparation that began weeks, sometimes months, before he ever set foot inside a house at night. The jogging was reconnaissance. He mapped every street, every approach, every retreat path. He identified which houses had dogs, which had motion lights, which backed onto open fields where he could move without being seen. He noted which neighbors kept late hours and which went to bed at 9. He built a comprehensive intelligence picture of his target and her surroundings that any professional surveillance operative would have recognized. Then came the phone calls. Victims in the weeks before their attacks began reporting strange calls, hang-ups, silence on the line, and sometimes a voice, low, deliberate, controlled, saying things that made their blood go cold. He was testing them, learning their schedules, their reactions, their levels of alertness. He was confirming everything he had already learned on foot. And then, when he was ready, when every variable had been accounted for, he came at night. He brought rope, cut to specific lengths, prepared in advance. He brought a flashlight. He sometimes brought food, which he consumed in the homes of victims he held for hours, which tells you something about his psychology that is extremely difficult to sit with. He was comfortable, confident, completely in control of himself and his environment. He attacked with his face covered. He disguised his voice. He gave away nothing that could identify him. Witnesses could describe a white male, athletic, average height, mid to late 20s, and that was essentially all. The composite sketches looked like roughly 100,000 men in the Sacramento metropolitan area. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department threw everything at the case. The Sacramento Police Department, the FBI, task forces, tip lines that were off the hook with thousands of calls, each one requiring investigation, each one leading nowhere. Suspects were interviewed and cleared, alibis were checked, theories were built and dismantled. He was not found. In 1977-7, something happened that should have been the break investigators were desperate for. In 1977, someone believed to be the East Area Rapist called a Sacramento area law enforcement line. Investigators could not prove every detail from the call by voice alone, but the message became one of the most chilling artifacts of the case. Not a witness, not a neighbor, but a caller presenting himself as the man they were hunting. The recording was played for investigators who had spent months trying to find him. They listened to it dozens of times, hundreds of times. The voice was calm. That was the first thing. Not agitated, not boastful, not unstable. Calm in the way of someone who has thought carefully about what they are going to say and has decided exactly how to say it. He talked about the crimes. He acknowledged them. He was not calling to confess. He was calling to tell the investigators working around the clock to find him something very specific. He was telling them they would fail, that he was smarter than they were, that he had been doing this for years and would continue for as long as he chose. He was right about the timeline. He would continue for 9 more years. Investigators replayed the recording again and again, searching for anything useful. An accent, a background sound, a verbal habit, a clue to age or education. What they had finally was not enough. It was another piece of terror, another sign of control, but not the key that opened the case. Beyond that, the recording gave them nothing that could identify him. And then the calls stopped. The attacks in Sacramento slowed in 1978. By 1979, they had ceased. The task force allowed themselves a cautious exhale. Maybe he had died. Maybe he had been imprisoned for something unrelated. Maybe he had moved away. They did not know. They would never know for certain until decades later. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that he had not stopped. He had evolved. And what he had evolved into was far, far worse. There is a name that California law enforcement used for the next phase of the crimes before anyone connected them to the East Area Rapist in Sacramento. They called him the original Night Stalker. In October of 1979, Goleta, a quiet community near Santa Barbara on the California coast, the scene of a failed attack that investigators would later view as part of the same pattern. Then on December 30th, 1979, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were murdered in Goleta. The crime had characteristics that, to anyone who had studied the Sacramento cases closely, would have seemed familiar. The careful entry, the ligatures, the controlled, methodical presence. But the Sacramento investigators were not the ones who caught this case. Southern California detectives were. And to them, this looked like a new offender. He struck again in Goleta, then in Ventura, then in Dana Point, then in Irvine. He worked his way down the coast over 7 years. He killed couples now, not single women. He was more violent, more final. 13 people died. A teenage girl's father in Visalia, a young married couple in Rancho Cordova, a couple in Goleta, a lawyer and his wife in Ventura, a doctor and his wife in Dana Point, a woman alone in Irvine. A newlywed couple in Orange County. 13 human beings who had gone to bed on an ordinary night and never woke up again. 13 people who had families, histories, futures, whole worlds of love and work and small daily joy, and all of it was taken by one man who cased their neighborhood, studied their habits, and came for them in the dark. For years, the Sacramento cases and the Southern California cases were treated as separate. Different jurisdictions, different profiles, different investigators. The idea that the prolific serial predator terrorizing the Sacramento suburbs had quietly evolved into a serial killer working his way down the California coast was not a connection anyone made in real time. It would take forensic science, years of painstaking work, and the stubborn refusal of a small number of detectives to let either case go cold before the truth became visible. The same man. All of it. Every single crime, from Tulare County and the Sacramento region in the 1970s to Irvine in 1986. One person, one nightmare in two acts. In May of 1986, the Golden State Killer committed his last known crime. A woman murdered in Irvine, Orange County. All the signatures were there, the preparation, the ligatures, the controlled violence, and then silence, complete, total, absolute silence. No more attacks, no more murders, no more phone calls, no more reports from neighborhoods of a white male jogging through streets at unusual hours, mapping houses, studying patterns. Nothing. He was gone. Investigators were left with a question that would haunt the case for the next 3 decades. Why did he stop? A man who had operated with this level of discipline and frequency, who had struck again and again across a decade with almost no mistakes, does not usually vanish from a case file without a reason. Investigators and profilers considered many possibilities, but none of them could be proved from the outside. So what happened? Some investigators theorized injury, a serious physical impairment that made the athletic demands of his method impossible. Some theorized a change in his personal circumstances, a new relationship, a new job, a new structure of accountability that closed the windows he had been using. Some theorized that the growing sophistication of forensic science had finally scared him cautious enough to stop. The most unsettling theory was the simplest one. He chose to stop because he had always been in total control of himself. He started when he decided to start. He escalated when he decided to escalate. He stopped when he decided he was done. The discipline that had made him almost impossible to catch was the same discipline that could make him simply walk away when the calculation shifted. He walked back into ordinary life, and ordinary life swallowed him whole. Before we go any further, I need you to stop thinking about the killer for a moment. I need you to think about the people. Because the mistake that true crime stories make, the mistake that investigation files make, the mistake that headlines make, is that they reduce human beings to their worst moment, to the moment they became a victim, to the case number assigned to their death. The 13 people DeAngelo admitted murdering were not case numbers. Claude Snelling was 45 years old, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia. In September of 1975, he was shot while trying to stop the abduction of his daughter from their home. Long before the world knew the name Golden State Killer, there was already a family in Tulare County living with the cost of the man who would later be identified as Joseph DeAngelo. Brian and Katie Maggiore were 21 years old. They were newlyweds, married just 7 months, and they were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova on a February night in 1978 when the East Area rapist encountered them. They ran. He chased them. He shot them both. Brian died in the street. Katie died moments later in a neighbor's yard. She was 20 years old. She was clutching her dog's leash when she was found. They were 21. They were newly married. They were walking their dog. Robert Offerman was a doctor in Goleta, California. He was 44 years old. He was engaged to a woman named Deborah Manning. On the night of December 30th, 1979, they were both murdered in his condominium. Investigators who worked the scene said that Offerman had managed to free himself from his ligatures during the attack. He had fought back. Whatever he was able to do, it was not enough. He and Deborah Manning were both killed. He fought. That matters. It should be remembered. Charlene and Lyman Smith were murdered in Ventura in 1980. Charlene was 33 years old. Lyman was 43, a prominent local lawyer. Their teenage son was asleep in another room of the house that night. He was not harmed physically, but he woke up to a morning that no child should ever have to wake up to. He grew up without his parents. He carried that for decades. He was in Sacramento for the sentencing hearing in 2020, and when he spoke, the room heard 40 years of that loss in every word. Manuela Wittun was 28 years old when she was murdered in Irvine in February of 1981. She had been alone in her home. For decades, her family carried the same impossible absence, the same silence, the same question: who had done this and why had he vanished? Patrice Harrington was 27 years old. Keith Harrington was 24. They were newlyweds, married 3 months, living in Dana Point. They were both murdered in August of 1980. Patrice's father, a detective in the Orange County Sheriff's Department, spent years working adjacent to the investigation, never knowing that the case that haunted his professional life was the same case that had destroyed his personal one. Gregory Sanchez was 27 years old. Cherry Domingo was 35. They were killed in Goleta in July of 1981. Cherry's daughter, who was not home that night, grew up knowing what had happened to her mother and not knowing who had done it. She attended the sentencing hearing in 2020 and stood at the microphone and said the things she had been carrying for nearly 40 years. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old. She was the youngest of the Golden State Killer's murder victims. She was killed in Irvine in May of 1986. She was home alone. She had been out with friends earlier that evening. She came home. She was found the following day. 18 years old. These are not statistics. They are not data points in a forensic profile. They are Brian and his new wife walking their dog. They are a doctor who fought back. They are a woman's father who spent his career trying to solve his own grief without knowing it. They are an 18-year-old girl who came home after a night out with friends and never saw the morning. The Golden State Killer took all of them. He took everything they would have been. Every year, every relationship, every ordinary Tuesday, every grandchild they would have held, every phone call they would have made, every meal they would have cooked, every problems they would have solved, gone, taken. By one man in one house in one night, multiplied 13 times over 7 years. That is what the orange jumpsuit means. That is the weight that was finally attached to a name on April 24th, 2018. Remember them. Cold cases do not die quietly. Not the real ones. Not the ones that get under the skin of the right investigator at the right moment. The ones that lodge there and refuse to be dislodged no matter how many years pass, no matter how many other cases pile up on the desk. Paul Holes was that kind of investigator. He joined the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office as a forensic specialist in the early 1990s. He was meticulous, serious, the kind of man who treated the evidence in a case as a language that was trying to tell him something, and who kept listening long after most people would have moved on. When he first encountered the Golden State Killer files in the mid 1990s, something happened that does not happen on every case. He became personally invested in a way that was difficult to explain and impossible to shake. In the years since the crimes, forensic science had advanced in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first worked the case in 1976. The biological evidence collected at crime scenes, evidence that had been carefully preserved in storage through all the years of silence, could now be analyzed to produce a DNA profile, a complete, detailed, specific biological signature that was as unique to its owner as a fingerprint. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators had enough DNA evidence to do what earlier detectives could not: connect crimes that had once been treated as separate series. They had built it from the evidence left behind at multiple crime scenes, confirming that all the crimes were connected, confirming that all of them had been committed by a single individual. They had a usable genetic signature of the Golden State Killer. They had no idea whose signature it was. Paul Holes ran that profile against every available database. He worked with other agencies. He updated and refined the profile as technology improved. He attended conferences, consulted with the best forensic minds in the country, shared information with other investigators who were carrying pieces of the same puzzle. He never stopped looking for a match, year after year. No match. The case aged. The original detectives retired. The victims got older. The world moved on in the way that worlds do, the rolling urgency of new crimes and new crises constantly pushing older ones further toward the back of the file cabinet. Paul Holes did not move on. And in 2012, someone else picked up the same torch. Someone who was not a detective. Someone who was not a forensic scientist. Someone who was a writer and a mother and a woman who had been haunted by unsolved violence since she was a child. Her name was Michelle McNamara. To understand what Michelle McNamara meant to this case, you have to understand what she was like, not as a writer, as a person. She grew up in a suburb of Chicago. When she was a teenager, a young woman in her neighborhood was murdered. The case went unsolved. Michelle was 14 years old, and that unsolved murder planted something in her that never fully went dormant: a need to understand how violence worked, how it went unpunished, how the people left behind were supposed to continue living in its shadow. She read everything she could find about crime, about killers and investigations and the forensic science that was slowly changing what justice meant. She studied how cases were built and how they fell apart. She started a blog called True Crime Diary that was different from most of what existed in that space because it was not voyeuristic and it was not sensational. It was serious, rigorous, and it was written with a genuine, almost fierce empathy for the human beings at the center of every case. She married a comedian named Patton Oswalt. She had a daughter. She had a full life, a good life, a life that was busy in all the ways any parent's life is busy. And in the hours when her daughter was asleep and her husband was asleep and the house was quiet, she would sit at her desk and go back to the cases she could not let go of. The Golden State Killer found her at one of those midnight research sessions around 2012. And when she found the case, something clicked into place in her that she could not fully describe. She went deep, past deep. She filed Freedom of Information requests and obtained police reports. She traveled to crime scenes and walked through them. She corresponded with survivors and sat with their grief and their strength and wrote about them with a care that made the people she described feel seen, not used. She corresponded with investigators, including Paul Holes, who recognized almost immediately that this was a woman who understood the case at a level most journalists never reached. She pored over the evidence late into the night, night after night, constructing theories and dismantling them, building a portrait of the man she was hunting that was more detailed and more human than any official profile. She was not interested in the monster version of the story. She wanted to understand the actual man, the specific person, because specific people can be found. Monsters are abstract. People leave evidence. In 2013, she published a long-form article in Los Angeles Magazine that changed the public conversation about the case in one decisive way. She gave him a name, the Golden State Killer. She chose the name deliberately, carefully. She wanted a name that communicated the scale of what he had done. That framed it not as a collection of local incidents, but as an assault on an entire state, on the idea of California itself, on the safety and freedom that California had promised to everyone who came there, hoping for something better. The name traveled. It was picked up by media, by law enforcement, by investigators who had been using other names for decades. It became the name, and with it, the case found a new audience, a new urgency, a new generation of people who had not been alive in 1976, but who were now, through Michelle McNamara's writing, invested in the outcome. She was writing a book, a full account of the case, the crimes, the investigation, her own obsession. She believed, with a certainty she could not entirely justify and could not shake, that the Golden State Killer would be found. She wrote that certainty into every page. She titled the book, "I'll Be Gone in the Dark." The phrase was something the killer had reportedly said to a victim in the 1970s, a taunt, a boast, a declaration of his own invincibility. Michelle McNamara took those words and turned them into a promise. She was going to find him. The dark was not going to protect him forever. She was right. She just never got to know it. On April 21st, 2016, Michelle McNamara went to sleep in her home in Los Angeles and did not wake up. She was 46 years old. The cause was the accidental combined effect of prescription medications and an undiagnosed heart condition. Her husband, Patton Oswalt, found her. Their daughter was 4 years old. The manuscript for the book was unfinished. Patton Oswalt worked with her researchers, her collaborators, and her editor to complete it. The book was published in February of 2018. It went straight to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. The world read it and grieved for her, and felt in reading it something of what she had felt in writing it, the urgent, aching need to finish what she had started. 2 months after the book came out, the Golden State Killer was arrested. She had been right. She just ran out of time to see it. To understand how they finally found him, you need to understand something about DNA that most people never think about. When you submit your DNA to a genealogy company, you are not just submitting information about yourself. You are submitting information about every person who shares your bloodline, every cousin, every aunt, every distant relative you have never met and will never meet. Your DNA is their DNA. Partially, it reaches back through generations and connects you to people you do not even know exist. In 2017 and early 2018, investigators working with genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter used a method that had never before been demonstrated so publicly and powerfully on a serial predator case of this scale. Law enforcement databases contain the DNA of convicted criminals. If the Golden State Killer had ever been convicted of a crime that required a DNA sample, his profile would have matched. It had been checked against every available database many times over many years. There was no match. But what about genealogy databases? The commercial databases used by millions of Americans to trace their family trees? One of these platforms, a nonprofit site called GEDmatch, had hundreds of thousands of profiles as uploaded voluntarily by people who wanted to find genetic relatives. The Golden State Killer was not in GEDmatch, but his relatives might be. A DNA profile developed from crime scene evidence was uploaded to GEDmatch for investigative comparison. She was not looking for him directly. She was looking for partial matches, relatives, people who shared enough genetic material with the killer to suggest a common ancestor somewhere in the family tree. The partial matches came back, and then the work began. Work that required a combination of forensic science, genealogical research, historical records, and sheer relentless dedication that is almost impossible to fully describe. From each partial match, Ray Venner began building family trees, working backward to common ancestors, then working forward again, through every branch, through every generation, identifying every male descendant who fell into the right age range and geographic location, birth records, death records, census data, Marriage records, immigration records, obituaries, the kind of historical paperwork that accumulates around a human life like sediment. She built trees that contained dozens of people, then narrowed them again. She eliminated candidates based on geography, age, physical characteristics. She confirmed and eliminated, the trees shrank. And then there was one name. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8th, 1945 in Bath, New York. He served in the United States Navy as a mechanic. He attended Sacramento State University and earned a criminal justice degree. He became a police officer. He carried a badge and a gun and swore an oath to protect the communities he served. He joined the Auburn Police Department in 1976. 1976. The same year the East Area rapist attacks began in Sacramento. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979. The charge was shoplifting. He had been caught stealing a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a store in Auburn. He lost his badge over a hammer and a can of spray. 1979, the year the Sacramento attacks ended and the murders in Southern California began. After losing his badge, DeAngelo faded into civilian life. He got married. He had 3 daughters. He worked for decades as a truck mechanic for a grocery distribution company. He lived in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, the same region, the same flat, sun-baked streets, the same suburban neighborhoods he had terrorized in the 1970s. He was right there. He grew old in a house that sat behind a fence. Neighbors described him as difficult, sometimes aggressive, the kind of man who yelled about noise and property lines and who was easier to avoid than to engage. But difficult neighbors are not uncommon. Nobody looked at Joseph DeAngelo and saw anything more than an irritable retired man who kept to himself. He was 72 years old when the genetic genealogy work led investigators to his name. Now they needed one more thing. They needed his DNA. When investigators identified DeAngelo as their primary suspect in early 2018, they faced a delicate and high-stakes problem. They could not simply arrest him. Not on the basis of genealogical research alone. They needed a direct DNA match between him and the crime scene evidence. And they needed to obtain that match without tipping him off, without giving him any warning that after 40 years of invisibility, the walls were finally closing in. Think about that for a moment. They knew. They were almost certain they knew. The family trees had pointed unmistakably to one man. The age was right, the location was right, the timeline was right. The physical description from the 1970s matched who he would have been then. Everything lined up, and they could not touch him. Not yet. Because in the American legal system, almost certain is not enough. They needed the DNA. They needed the proof that would make the case unassailable in court. The proof that would hold up to every challenge DeAngelo's defense attorneys could mount. The proof that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. So they watched. A surveillance team, careful and professional and completely invisible to DeAngelo, moved around his life in Citrus Heights. They watched him leave his house. They watched him run his errands. They noted his patterns. And they waited for an opportunity to collect a sample of his biological material from a public location. Something he had discarded or touched and left behind, something that could be legally collected and rushed to a laboratory. The opportunity came. Investigators collected discarded DNA samples connected to him, including material from his car door while he was shopping and a tissue from his curbside trash. The samples were rushed for comparisons against the old crime scene DNA. Meanwhile, Paul Holes was 25 days into his retirement. 25 days. He had spent more than 2 decades on this case. He had seen technology evolve from the crude forensic methods of the 1990s to the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had finally pointed a finger at one man. He had conducted interviews, attended conferences, walked crime scenes, run the DNA profile against every database that existed. He had given the case more of himself than he could fully quantify. And then he had retired. Because careers end. Because human beings are not infinite. Because there comes a point at which you have done everything you know how to do, and you have to trust that the people still working will carry it the rest of the way. He was sitting with the hope that it was DeAngelo, and the fear that it might not be, and the particular agony of a man who had chased the same answer for 22 years and was now waiting for a phone call that would tell him whether he had finally run it to ground. In April 2018, the laboratory results came back. Perfect match. The discarded DNA linked to DeAngelo matched the DNA from crime scenes committed decades earlier. The genealogy had pointed to him. The direct DNA comparison now confirmed the case against him. It was him. The calls went out to all the relevant jurisdictions: Sacramento, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange County. All the places where the Golden State Killer had left bodies and DNA and devastation. All the agencies that had worked pieces of this case for decades. One by one, they were told. The next morning, April 24th, 2018, a team of law enforcement officers drove to a quiet street in Citrus Heights, California. They parked. They approached the house. In the front yard, an old man was working, 72 years old, white-haired, wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary retired man on an ordinary spring morning. He did not run. He had nowhere to run. He had spent 40 years running, but not in the way that looks like running. He had run by standing still, by being ordinary, by being invisible. And now the invisibility was over, and the running was over, and there were officers on his lawn, and he was out of moves. They told him he was under arrest. They put handcuffs on the wrists of the man who had tied dozens of victims with ropes he cut himself. They led him to a vehicle on the same streets he had jogged through in the 1970s, mapping other people's houses, counting other people's vulnerabilities. According to investigators and later accounts, he seemed stunned that the quiet life he had built had finally been penetrated. After decades of invisibility, the man they had hunted was standing in handcuffs. Paul Holes received a phone call. He had been retired for 25 days. He picked up and heard the words he had spent 22 years waiting to hear. It was him. They had him. He was in custody. Whatever Paul Holes felt in that moment, he has said that no words have been quite adequate to describe it. 22 years. More than 8,000 days of looking for one man. And then a phone call on a Tuesday morning in April, 25 days after he walked out of his office for the last time. The case had found him. Or more precisely, decades of evidence preservation, patient police work, genetic genealogy, and the public attention kept alive by writers and survivors had found him. The Golden State Killer was in handcuffs. When the arrest was announced on April 25th, 2018, the reaction broke open something that had been held shut for a very long time. Survivors who were now in their 60s and 70s heard the name Joseph DeAngelo for the first time. Some of them heard it alone on the phone from an investigator calling to tell them that the man who had come into their homes in the night had finally been identified. Some heard it on the news. Some found out through friends who called them in the middle of the day, unable to wait. Some of them cried. Some went completely silent. Some felt a rush of feeling so complicated that they could not immediately name it, relief mixed with grief, mixed with 40 years of anger that had never had a face to attach itself to. And now, finally, it did. Investigators who had worked the cases for decades received the news with a combination of exhaustion and something close to joy. Detectives who had retired, forensics analysts who had long since moved on to other cases, people who had carried pieces of this case for so long that it had become part of how they identified themselves as the person still working the East Area rapist case, as the detective who never let the original Night Stalker go, now had to sit with the fact that it was over. Paul Holes learned the news by phone. He had been retired for 25 days. 25 days after the career that had consumed more than 2 decades of his professional life came to a close, the case that had defined it was finally solved. He has described that phone call in subsequent interviews as one of the most overwhelming moments of his life. Not triumphant, not exactly. More like the release of a weight he had been carrying. For so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. And then there was the conversation about Michelle McNamara. She had been dead for less than 2 years. Her book had been out for 2 months. And the man she had spent years hunting, the man she had named, the man she had written about with a clarity and a fury and a prophetic certainty that had given the case a new life at exactly the right moment, had been arrested. Patton Oswalt learned the news and posted something that was read by millions of people around the world. He said his wife had believed this day would come. He said she had been right. He said he wished she were there. He did not need to say anything else. When Joseph DeAngelo appeared in court for the first time, cameras were there to capture the image that would circulate everywhere. He was in a wheelchair. He was dressed in a hospital gown. He was white-haired, deeply lined, frail-looking in the way that men in their 70s can look frail when they are suddenly moved from the privacy of their own home into the harsh light of public view. People who had feared him for 40 years looked at this old man in a wheelchair and felt something that they had not anticipated. Not fear, not rage, something stranger. This was him? This shuffling, ordinary, aging man who looked like someone's difficult grandfather. This was the shadow. This was the presence that had made an entire region of California afraid to sleep with the windows open. This was the man who had called women in the middle of the night to remind them that he had not forgotten them. He looked like nothing. He looked like no one. That was the lesson, and it was not a comfortable one. The face of evil, when it decides to wear the mask of ordinary life, looks exactly like ordinary life. Exactly. Without any visible seam. He had worn that mask for 40 years. He had walked through the world in it, worked in it, raised daughters in it, retired in it, and it had never slipped. Not once. Not in any way that anyone around him could see. Legal proceedings moved forward over the months that followed. DeAngelo was represented by attorneys. He was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder. He faced additional charges related to the Sacramento assaults. The evidence against him was, by any standard, overwhelming. The DNA evidence alone was definitive. There was no viable defense. But the legal process is not designed for speed. It is designed for thoroughness. And in a case of this magnitude, thoroughness took time. DeAngelo said almost nothing in public. He appeared at hearings, was led in and out of courtrooms, and gave the world no explanation, no context, no window into the interior of the man who had done these things. Survivors waited. Families waited. The world watched a process that moved at its own pace, regardless of the impatience surrounding it. Then, in June of 2020, it all came to a point. On June 29th, 2020, Joseph DeAngelo appeared in a Sacramento courtroom and pled guilty. 13 murders, numerous rape charges that fell within the applicable statute of limitations. He agreed to waive any future claim of mental defect or insanity. He agreed to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he agreed to something else. Something that had been negotiated into the plea deal by prosecutors who understood what it meant to the people who had been waiting 40 years for this. He agreed to sit and listen. The sentencing hearing was held in August of 2020 at a Sacramento convention center, large enough to allow the COVID-era distancing required at the time. Survivors came, families of the murdered came, investigators came. People who had spent 40 years carrying what this man had done to them or to someone they loved came to a convention center in Sacramento, stood at a microphone, and said what they had never been able to say before. Not to a case file, not to a therapist, not to a photograph in a cold case folder, to him. For hours, one after another, they spoke. Some were steady, some trembled, some wept openly. Some had clearly rehearsed every word. Some spoke off the top of their hearts in words that came out raw and unfiltered and completely true. A woman who had been attacked in Sacramento in 1977 walked to the microphone and looked at the man at the defense table. She was in her 60s now. She had lived with what he did to her for more than 40 years. She had raised a family and built a life and carried this thing inside her through all of it. And standing in that convention center looking at Joseph DeAngelo, she said something that silenced the entire room. She said, "I want you to know that I am not afraid of you anymore. I want you to know that you lost." A woman whose parents had been murdered by DeAngelo spoke about who her parents actually were. Not victims, she said. People. A father who loved bad puns. A mother who made a specific kind of soup on cold days. People who had a whole world of small loves and daily rituals that had been erased by this man in a single night. She described what her childhood had been like without them. She described what their absence had cost her. And she looked at D'Angelo and she named the cost out loud so that there was no way for him to sit in the room and not feel the specific weight of what he had taken. And then it was his turn. After hours of testimony, after all of it, after 40 years of silence and hiding in ordinary suburban life, after the jogging and the phone calls and the rope and the 13 bodies and the 50 plus attacks and the grandchildren and the mowed lawn and the retirement, after all of it, Joseph D'Angelo stood up. He shuffled to the microphone. The room held its breath. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I have listened to all of your statements, each one of them, and I am truly sorry to everyone I have harmed." That was all. No explanation. No accounting. No answer to the question every survivor had carried for 40 years, the simple, devastating question of why. Just 11 words and a shuffling step back from the microphone. For some people in that room, it was not nearly enough. It could not be. No words ever could be. For others, it was, at minimum, this, the admission. The public, on the record, legally documented acknowledgement that he had done it, that he knew what he had done, that he could no longer pretend otherwise, that the man who had believed he would be gone in the dark forever was standing in a public room, identified by name, unable to escape the weight of who he was. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led away. Joseph DeAngelo's arrest did something that no other criminal case in American history had quite managed to do. It proved definitively and publicly that investigative genetic genealogy could solve cases that had been unsolvable by every other means. Within months of the arrest, law enforcement agencies across the country were applying the same method to their own cold cases. Murders from the 1970s and 1980s, rapes, cases that had survived in the memories of investigators and families for decades without resolution. Dozens of them broke open. Families who had lived with unidentified killers for 30 and 40 years learned names. Survivors who had been told that their cases had no viable leads received phone calls from investigators with news they had stopped believing would ever come. Barbara Ray Venter, the genetic genealogist whose work helped identify DeAngelo, was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people of 2019. She deserved every word of that recognition and more. But the method also opened a conversation that is still happening in courtrooms and legislatures and ethics classrooms about the line between justice and privacy. When you submit your DNA to a genealogy website, you are consenting to that database using your genetic information for genealogical purposes. You are not consenting to law enforcement building a family tree from your profile in the course of a murder investigation. Your relatives did not consent to being part of any investigation at all. Where is the line? What are the limits? Who decides how this extraordinary tool can and cannot be used? These are real questions with real stakes, questions that courts and lawmakers are still working through. For the families of 13 murder victims, those questions are abstract in a way they can afford to hold at a distance. They have answers. They know the name. They watched him be led away. Whatever ethical complexity surrounds the method that found him, the weight of that sits differently when you spent 40 years not knowing. Here's the thing about Joseph DeAngelo that will stay with you. He coached a youth football team. He had grandchildren. His neighbors, the ones who found him irritable and difficult, never imagined anything darker behind the irritability than the ordinary sourness of an aging man who valued his privacy. He went to church. He drove to the grocery store. He paid his bills. He watched television. He did all the small, unremarkable things that ordinary life is made of. And he did this for 30 years after he stopped killing. 30 years of ordinary days, ordinary routines, ordinary suburban anonymity, while somewhere in California, investigators were still hunting him, while Paul Holes was still running his DNA profile against every new database that came online, while Michelle McNamara was staying up past midnight building a portrait of a man she was certain could be found, while survivors were still waking up from nightmares, still checking their locks, still flinching at sounds in the night. He was right there, in the same suburban Sacramento corridor he had terrorized, living among the descendants of the community he had broken. The lesson is not comfortable. We want to believe that the people capable of extraordinary violence announce themselves, that they look different, act different. That if a man like Joseph DeAngelo moved in next door, we would feel it somehow, some vibration of wrongness that would alert us. He lived next door to people for 30 years. They felt nothing. Evil is not always loud, it is not always visible. Sometimes it looks exactly like the man who nods at you from his driveway on a Tuesday morning. Unremarkable, forgettable, ordinary in every way you can see. But here is the other truth. The one that matters just as much. He was found. After 40 years, he was found. Not because he made a mistake, not because he confessed, not because the universe handed law enforcement an obvious answer. He was found because Paul Holes refused to stop working. Because genetic genealogy was applied with patience and precision, building a tree, branch by patient branch, that led to his door. Because Michelle McNamara poured years of her life into keeping the story alive at the exact moment when the technology to solve it was finally ready. Because survivors refused to be silent, and families refused to stop demanding answers, and investigators who could have quietly let old cases fade chose instead to keep going. All of that found him. The stubbornness found him. The grief found him. The science found him. The love, the fierce, unrelenting love of the people who demanded justice for the dead and for the living, that found him too. In the final pages of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, Michelle McNamara wrote directly to the man she had spent years hunting. She addressed him by the name she had given him, the Golden State Killer. She said she knew what she looked like to him, just another amateur with a blog and a fixation, someone he would never have considered a threat. She said she knew what he thought about the people who hunted him, that they were slower than him, that they were stuck in the past, that the tools available to them were not equal to the task. She told him he was wrong. She told him the world had changed. She told him the science had changed in ways he could not anticipate from inside his ordinary life. She told him that the same traits that had made him effective had made him traceable in ways he did not understand and could not see. She told him that the anonymity he had counted on was not permanent, that the darkness he had lived inside for 40 years was not absolute. And she wrote near the end, "You'll be wearing an orange jumpsuit." She died before she finished the book. She died before the arrest. She died not knowing whether the certainty she had felt, the bone deep conviction that he would be found, was going to be vindicated or was going to become one more broken promise that the case had made to the people who worked it. On April 25th, 2018, photographs of Joseph DeAngelo in an orange jumpsuit circulated around the world. Patton Oswalt saw them. He thought of his wife. He thought of the she had spent at that desk in the middle of the night, building the portrait of a man she was certain existed and could be found. He thought of the title she had chosen, the taunt she had turned into a promise. She said he would be gone in the dark. She said that to him as a warning, not as a surrender. She was right. He is gone now, not in the way he planned, not invisible, not free, not unreachable. Gone into a prison cell in California without the possibility of parole, with the weight of 13 murders and 50 plus assaults and 40 years of terror attached to his name for every day that remains of his life. The dark did not protect him. The dark never protects them. Not forever. Not when the right people refuse to stop looking. Not when science keeps moving. Not when the people left behind refuse to let the world forget. Michelle McNamara is buried in a cemetery in Los Angeles. Paul Holes has written a book about the case and speaks publicly about investigative genetic genealogy. Barbara Ray Venter continues her work. The survivors continue their lives. The families of 13 murder victims carry their grief forward. Lighter now, not by much, but by something. And somewhere in a California state prison, an elderly man is serving life without parole for crimes he thought he had gotten away with. He was wrong. They always are. If this story reached you, share it. The people who carried this case for decades deserve to be remembered. The survivors deserve to be heard. And Michelle McNamara deserves to know, wherever she is, that she was right. I'll be gone.